So yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm Rosie. I'm the Research and Marketing Coordinator at Red Eye, so I'll be running this event for you today. For anyone that hasn't come to a Red Eye event before, Red Eye is a non-profit organisation built for the community by the community. And today is a perfect example of that as we invite one of our members, Marge Bradshaw, to share her photographic career. So I'll do a quick intro to Marge. Marge Bradshaw is a socially engaged photographer interested in people, place, and heritage. She uses a combination of documentary and environmental portrait photography to share the lived experience of participants, often giving a platform for voices not usually heard. She also works with corporate and private clients and has been published in various national and specialist media, including the BBC and The Guardian. So Marge will be talking for roughly around 50 minutes, and then there will be time for questions at the end. So can I please ask everyone to stay muted while Marge is talking, and then you can unmute and ask the questions for yourself at the end if you'd like to. If you have any burning questions while the talk is going on, you're welcome to put them in the chat and we can get back to them at the end. If for any reason anyone gets kicked out, not that you will, I will of course let you back in, but also, like I said, this meeting is being recorded, so you won't miss anything, so don't worry about that. If there are any issues or anything you want to bring to my attention, please just use the chat, or you can also email me directly at rosie@redeye.org.uk, but I'll pop my email in the chat now in case you want to get in touch. But I think that's it, so over to you, Marge.
Yay, thanks Rosie. And thanks to Red Eye for asking me to do this session today. So I'm really in the early days of my photography journey. I know you said career earlier, Rosie, but it's really early days. So I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience so far. And yeah, hopefully it will be useful to those of you, especially those of you who are thinking about doing photography as a second career, or perhaps are coming to it later in life as I did, or are perhaps interested in developing a socially engaged practice. So I'm going to talk about my route into photography to give you a bit of background, and then how personal projects have had such a big impact on my progression. I'll then talk about my experience so far in attempting to develop a socially engaged practice. So I'll explain what it means, certainly to me. I'll talk about my pathway into socially engaged practice. I'll go through a couple of examples of projects so you can see the type of approach I use, and I'll touch on ethics and how sustainable practice has helped my work. Then I'm going to finish off with some, how shall I put this, honest truths, I guess, about where I've failed and what I've struggled with. And that's both with running 2 freelance businesses, which I'll explain about, and being an artist opposed to working in the corporate or private client world as a photographer. And then I'm going to finish off with sharing what's next for me. So my Arts Council project grant and some tips around applying for grants, certainly things I found useful in case that's helpful to anyone. So hopefully that looks like a good use of everyone's time for the next 50 minutes. And like I say, happy to hang around and answer any questions. So yeah, I suppose I should start with explaining how I ended up here. So where to start? Back in July, it was in 2019, I found myself in the photo pit at Lytham Festival alongside lots of other photographers who were trying to get the best shots of the bands on stage. But 6 months before that, I'd never even held a DSLR. I've worked as a marketing and research professional for museums and galleries and archives for most of my working life. And I went freelance in 2008 to help cultural sector organisations, mostly museums and galleries and archives, all over the UK with their comms and evaluation and community consultation work. But when I got into my early 40s, I wanted a change. I'd been a hobbyist photographer with an old film camera for years. And after doing a bit of work with a really brilliant business coach called Simon Seligman, I decided it was either now or never. So basically, I wanted to professionally start creating my own work rather than promoting other people's. But I needed to make it work alongside my other freelance business, where you can see me in action here. And that was firstly because I didn't want to give it up in case everything went wrong. And also, I guess I'd spent years building the business as well. And secondly, because I couldn't afford to. So everything I'm going to talk about photography wise today has had to be developed and delivered alongside my other work life as a cultural freelancer. So as a big music fan, I got in touch with marketing teams at independent venues when I decided I was going to kind of do this, to ask about opportunities. And I just started shooting various gigs and festivals. I bought some secondhand gear and figured out how to use it. And I spent a lot of evenings learning what I could from other creatives in various webinars. But the best knowledge actually came, as everyone always says, from actually getting stuck in and learning from my mistakes, some of which you can see here. These obviously didn't go to the client. These are some awful straight out of camera shots, which shows the reality you're often faced with in music photography, and you have to find ways to make it work. And my personal view is, if you can successfully shoot music under the strict time restrictions, so usually you can only shoot the first 3 songs, if you can deal with stage furniture and dry ice blocking your shots and challenging lighting conditions like these, I think you can probably work just about anywhere. And then once I became a bit more confident, I started learning how to actually shoot in the daylight, and built a website and started knocking on a few doors to get some other commissions. So I went to cultural sector organisations and managed to get myself some commissions shooting outdoor events and activities, festivals, openings, and kind of stock imagery off the back really of my portfolio with music photography. And then after shooting a few family sessions for friends, I opened up bookings for family portraits and family documentary photography, all very natural, mostly repertoire style. And then I started shooting brand photography for businesses and freelancers. And I've tentatively dipped my toe into documentary wedding and civil ceremony photography. Although again, I've not had chance to do much in the way of promotion for that yet. Basically, I've been trying out different types of photography with corporate and private clients, and just working out which types of jobs I like doing, which ones I don't. Alongside those types of commissions, I wanted to develop my practice as an artist as well. And although I initially didn't want to sort of own up to the fact that I had another freelance job, mainly as I was worried that people would think I wasn't a proper photographer, I kind of started realizing that actually it was an advantage. So I became really interested in how I could potentially combine photography with the community consultation skills I've got from my other freelance life to work on something meaningful. But I really wasn't sure where to start. And then when the pandemic began in 2020, obviously work with corporate and private clients kind of stopped, and I got really interested in documentary photography, and especially social documentary work by photographers near me in the Northwest, like Claire Griffiths, who's here today. Hello, Claire. She's over in Blackpool. So I was looking at work by people like Claire, and I started getting into all of that. And with nothing else to lose, I started shooting a range of social documentary and portrait personal projects, which I thought were really important to cover and archive during the pandemic. But what I didn't realise at the time was how kind of crucial, important those personal projects were going to be in terms of opening doors and opportunities for me, especially in the visual arts world, away from corporate and private sector clients. So I just wanted to share some examples of that and show you where it's led to. So in exchange for a donation to local volunteers who were sewing PPE kit for hospital workers, I went and took doorstep portraits on my once a day walk, like loads of other photographers did. And there ended up being around 50 photographs on my website in a series called Howfen Portraits. West Autumn, where I live, is known locally as Howfen. And it's a bit cringy looking at these now, actually, because my style's really changed since I did these. But anyway, I did these portraits. You can have a look on my website. They're still all up on there. And that work was spotted by Museums Northumberland, who then commissioned me to do a social documentary series about hidden key workers in the county who were perhaps weren't being talked about in the media for their contribution. So this is Stephen, who's a psychological therapist, and his partner. And the whole project was tricky to do because I was living in Bolton under the really strict lockdown conditions. But luckily the commission came just as the 2-week lockdown lift happened for us here. I think we had 2 weeks of freedom in Bolton. So I was able to kind of head up to Northumberland, and I spent a few days travelling around the county and had a brew outside key workers' houses. You couldn't go in houses or gardens or anything. Recorded their story, so I interviewed them, and we did a shoot with them both in their work uniform or outfit, and then kind of as normal human beings wearing whatever they wore around the house. So like I say, you weren't allowed in people's homes or gardens at that point, so we had to get a bit creative with it. So the images of Stephen there were taken with me, kind of balanced on top of the really massive step ladder overlooking the garden from the road. And yeah, it's just really strange thinking back to that time, isn't it? And unfortunately, we couldn't exhibit the work at Woodhorn in Ashington as we planned. Woodhorn, it's like a museum there, because of COVID closures, but we actually showed the work in the communities it was taken instead, which I think possibly opened up access to people who perhaps might not have been confident in visiting the museum or engaging with the work in that space. So that was one positive. Off the back of that, Bolton Museum and Art Gallery asked me to do something similar with local people who'd made a significant impact during COVID. So fortunately, that work was able to be displayed at the museum, and you can see Chris, the greengrocer, that's my greengrocer, in front of his photograph there in this space. So I suppose what I'm saying is what started as a doorstep fundraiser ended up with 2 paid gallery commissions. I also worked with grassroots musicians during the pandemic in a series called Front of House. You know, we were hearing a lot in the media about how venues were struggling, but I wanted to get across the stories of how grassroots musicians were coping. So this followed a similar pattern. I did interviews with the musicians, and then did the shoot on the street or outside the house. I pitched that work to the BBC, and it ended up as a feature piece, which I was really pleased about. First of all, for the musicians. So for me, it was primarily about getting their stories out and sharing their experience, which hadn't been covered in the mainstream media. But there were also benefits to me too, bearing in mind I'd only been working as a photographer for about a year at this point. So it really helped me with like my website and search SEO, for example, and starting to actually build a reputation for what I do. And that series was also accepted for Warrington Contemporary Art Festival, a slap bang exhibition, which was at Castlefield Gallery's new art space in the town. So again, just from a personal project, I managed to achieve, you know, a few other things. And the last example of this, but you know, there were a few. I got in touch with my local vaccination site and managed to get access to one of the first Pfizer clinics to share how staff and volunteers were coping. I thought that was really important for us to document and archive. And I learned so much from doing these documentary photos, but mostly I got a brilliant relationship with the NHS in Bolton as a result, and they're now a core partner for a new project I'm working on, which I'll talk about later. So I didn't set out to kind of achieve any of these things necessarily through paid projects, but I've realised that they can help build relationships and I suppose open doors to paid commissions if you want them to. And I suppose they're a way of doing something creative without the requirements of a brief or a funder or any other stipulation on you as an artist. Well, the other thing I've realised with personal projects and my work generally, to be honest, is you need to be really clear about your why you're doing what you're doing, and my why might be completely different to yours. So thinking about your why is really important, whether it's for the participants or for you. So whether it's something that's helping you creatively or emotionally or financially or building reputation, whatever it is. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that it's hard to do personal projects which are unpaid. You know, I have to fit them around my caring and other work commitments. I also need to use my other freelance income to fund my time, and not everyone has the luxury of being able to do that. So I absolutely recognise that I'm speaking from a position of privilege here by having 2 jobs where one can feed the other. So then, although these social documentary projects increase my knowledge and help me work out my style, I came to realise, I suppose, that there weren't as many positive outcomes for those who'd been involved as there were for me. And that's when I became interested in socially engaged practice. Now, in terms of how I define socially engaged practice, for me, it's about using photography in a way that is collaborative, inclusive, and participatory. And usually it's about working with communities to document what's important to them rather than me doing it for them. And although it varies from person to person, for me, it is very much about the process of the interaction, where the conversations with and between members of the group, or the relationships that everyone develops, are of kind of equal, maybe even more important, but equal importance. They're of equal importance as the finished product. So with my socially engaged projects, I typically come up with some kind of creative framework in direct response to themes or topics or stories that are discussed or shaped by the people involved. And that happens whether I'm working on a one-to-one basis or in a group setting. Personally, I'd say that my social documentary work isn't socially engaged because the people taking part are fairly passive in the experience. You know, I do involve them in sharing their words and perhaps like how they're posed in their images, but that's not active enough for me to call it engagement. So I thought it might be helpful to share the process I followed to start developing a socially engaged practice alongside my other corporate and private photography jobs. And I should say this is an ongoing thing. It's very much early days for me, and I've got a load to learn. There will be people here in the room to quiz who've got a lot more experience than me, but everyone's story is different, isn't it? So I'll tell you mine. So the first thing I did, and would recommend to anyone wanting to get into this type of work, is to look out for professional development and training opportunities, especially if you can get to work on a live project at the same time. I actually applied for Open Eye Gallery's Crossing Sectors programme, which it's especially for creatives interested in developing a socially engaged practice. You don't have to be a photographer in terms of your background. And it was just brilliant for meeting other artists doing the same thing. And it also opened up a huge range of new contacts and networking opportunities through the speakers we had every week. And I know that Liz and the team at Open Eye are about to recruit for a new cohort for Crossing Sectors. I asked her if I was allowed to say that, and she said, yes, please share it. So you might want to keep your eyes open for that. I know that news is coming soon. And then just as Crossing Sectors was coming to an end, the Turnpike in Lee advertised 6 artist commissions for the Making of Us socially engaged programme, which I think is now on to its 3rd cohort of artists. Someone will put me right if that's wrong. And again, that was a really great opportunity because it blended CPD and training in the classroom with a live project that ran alongside it. So I was paired up with another artist, and we worked with a group of autistic adults, a centre called True Colours, to explore music and photography. So interestingly, with both of those CPD opportunities, it kind of reaffirmed that my other freelance skills could really help my socially engaged practice. And that's because you need a whole range of skills alongside creativity, whether it's facilitation or empathy or listening skills or just simply being organised. The second thing I did was to try and get a small commission to have a go at doing this kind of work by myself. And I was really fortunate to get a micro commission with Open Eye Gallery, which was an open call to explore something related to climate change or an issue in your local environment. So I decided to explore the community's response here in West Horton to the loss of green space. There's a lot of house and industry building that's going on here. And I suppose by doing that, instigate a creative conversation about the pros and cons of development, especially on Greenbelt. And I tried out 4 different approaches to just experiment really with different ways of being socially engaged and to start a creative conversation with people. So the first was a series of photography runs. So I got 4 members of the local running club together, and we did some photo runs which basically toured around 2 of the development sites. I could have recruited more runners, but I wanted to keep it small because it was just an R&D commission. And those runs were designed to instigate a conversation about opinions on the loss of green space, but to also think about the role of nature and the outdoors in well-being, given that these were runners, and kind of talk about what they do when it was gone. So we took photos, we took photos and recorded audio from those runs, including the noise from pile drivers that was going on around the sites at the time, and some of the bird calls we could hear. We had little macro lenses to use on our phones, and I gave them different tasks to do by themselves after the runs that we did together, and got them to share their images and thoughts on a closed Facebook group. And we had loads of conversations as we did those runs. So anything like from the NIMBY viewpoint, and the fact that if people continue to want everything now, like deliveries from Amazon in 2 hours, where are those warehouses going to go? They need to go somewhere. We talked about how housing needed to be affordable, and why couldn't it go on brownfield rather than greenbelt sites, and so on. So we were having these conversations. The second experiment was around bringing other community viewpoints into the mix. So I put an online submission page together for the public to upload their own stories and reflections and images. And that also meant I could get consent and their details for my mailing list for the project as well, with having it on my website. And I also shared the link on different local Facebook pages and on my own social media, and door drop flyers at houses next to some of the developments. And I got around 34, I think it was, submissions from the community over a month or so. I didn't push it massively, and I didn't have any kind of success measure really with this, but I was fairly pleased with that. You can see the contributions on the project page on my website, and I also use this space to share my own responses along the community ones as things got going as well. The third thing I ended up testing was creating activities specifically for families living next to the developments, and you can see the view that they had at the time. Some of those families on the right hand side there, this is now full of houses. And a couple of the runners had said to me that it might be useful to get children's views into the mix. So I decided to try out some what I call magic photography kits for kids. And I made some cyanotype paper, put some instructions together, and then door dropped them to kind of either people I'd met or got talking to through the community submissions, and those who lived in these particular spots. And the packs basically invited families to go on a walk around the nearby green belt that they'd be losing, collect up nature materials, and then use those to create their cyanotype. And the kids could share their written stories or thoughts with me or not, and I invited them to send me their work or recommend the pack to other families who might want to take part. I also started experimenting with my own responses at this point. So I was playing around with how I could show the loss we were dealing with through photograms. So I used some of the iPhone images I'd taken on the photo runs, and I made those into cyanotypes, and then purposefully destroyed the work over 2 or 3 stages of eco bleach toning, so the work eventually disappeared. And then finally, I wanted to go back to some of the people who've been involved and had particularly interesting stories to share. So I asked 2 of the people who'd contributed images to the online gallery to take me on a photo walk, to kind of expand on some of the conversations that they'd started in their public submission. One was Barry, you can see here, he's a local part-time farm worker. He showed me around some of the land he's worked on for many years, and was telling me all sorts of stories about nature and the loss of that space and the impact he thought it would have on landscape and nature and wildlife and his work. And then Katie, who's a runner but wasn't actually in my focus group of runners, and she submitted some images through the public submission about the loss of trail runs. So again, I went back to her and asked her if she'd go on a one-to-one walk. So we took this tour around where the running trails were. And for both of these participants, I created these environmental portraits, and I returned to the cyanotypes as well. So using some of the environmental portraits I'd taken, but this time using open source maps as a background for the cyanotype paper. There's loads more I wanted to do if I had time, but it was only a micro commission, just a few days work. But it was a really great opportunity just to have permission to play and try different things out, and to also have the work displayed at Open Eye Gallery too. So the micro commission was a good starting point. And the third thing I did to support my development with social engagement was to just keep building my creative skills, and being interested in sustainable approaches to photography kind of started the ball rolling with that. So I knew from my own experience that there's a lot of waste and a lot of gear that gets kind of chucked away or not used or stacked up. Disposable cameras being one example when you're running workshops with communities. And I've been to Photo London, and I'd seen some of them like amazing cameraless work by artists there, which inspired me to really start thinking about how I could reduce my carbon footprint working as a photographer, and perhaps just be a little more careful with the materials I was using and the way I was going about things. So I started reading up on alternative processes, and really started getting into lumen prints using out-of-date second-hand photographic paper. I've just put some more recent work on the slide there. And then again here, I've been working on some abstracts combining digital photography and lumen prints together. And also at the same time, I was trying to get to grips with amphotypes, so using plants and flowers as a way to produce these photograms. The one on the left is was made with a beetroot emulsion, and the one on the right is Forget Me Not, which was really relevant because the project that featured the person in the image was all about dementia. So whilst I was kind of doing that, I spotted Red Eyes, climate aware photography course, which I managed to get on in its first iteration. And that was great just to give me a better knowledge of the impact our work can have, including things I'd just not thought about. So whether that's in the materials I use, so scanning work instead of using fixers, or reducing the digital space I take up in the cloud, so not having like multiple copies of the same giant image everywhere, and whether it's to do with trading in gear and buying secondhand. I've really tried to start making some small changes in my practice. You can see a full list of what I've committed to on my website. So I actually wrote a sustainability policy after being on the Red Eye course, which I think Rose is going to pop into the chat, but it's also on the slide here too, if you want to check that out and see what kind of things I've changed or what I've been up to. But just to get back to my original point, because I do have a tendency to go off on tangents, I found that using these sustainable methods like amphotypes and lumen prints has actually been a really positive thing, as it's opened up a whole world of creative opportunities when I am working in groups in a socially engaged way. And I found that these methods are actually really accessible in circumstances where perhaps the word kind of photography is off-putting, and that you can develop trust with people by working with them to produce pieces like this. So developing creative skills. And then the last thing really I've tried to do is to go for some larger or full commissions. So one of which I'm going to share the approach with, and that's the Watch Factory Commission. So that's another socially engaged project with Open Eye Gallery, but in partnership with Community Integrated Care. So the Watch Factory, gosh, it's just such an amazing space. It's an extra care residential setting in Prescott. It's not a care home, it's an independent living space for anyone over 55 to live out, but there's additional support there if you need it. And the brief was to work with a group of people at the Watch Factory to run a photography club with the aim of reducing their social isolation, something just enjoyable that they could go to, and somewhere where they could learn new photography skills, which they could carry on doing once we'd finished. And I say we because I worked on this jointly with Sam Batley, who some of you will know. So we were both photographers in residence here from February to December last year. And the Watch Factory has just this most amazing heritage story and archive material to use as inspiration for conversation. So it was built in the late 1800s as a watch factory, and then it became a barracks in World War I, and then a printers and bookbinders after the war. So we had a recruitment event, and then we got people involved, and we spent about 6 or so weeks really getting to know the residents at weekly 2-hour sessions through various conversations and discussions around photos and objects they brought in. So we got to find out about their interests and listen to all the stories they had to tell us. And that might seem like a really, really long time, but it paid off further down the line in terms of having built that trust early on. But the primary benefit was that it meant we could really get to know the barriers faced by the individual residents and how we could overcome them. So whilst we absolutely left labels very much at the door, just to give you an idea about the group for context, we had people who had no speech or broken speech. We had members with limited motor skills who couldn't hold a camera or press a remote trigger. We had people living with dementia, someone who was visually impaired, another was hard of hearing, and they were all in the same group. So everything we did needed to be fully inclusive. And we had conversations between ourselves and with the group about what was good enough when it came to participation. So was it okay, for example, that Jane wasn't able to take a photo, but she could direct what she wanted to be taken by working a pair and have someone else take that shot for her. The sessions took place just as COVID restrictions were being properly lifted, really, in that setting, and the members of the group didn't all know each other. So we got them taking Polaroid portraits of each other, sharing personal stories, finding out about each other and writing those things down. And we found that pairing up the members of the group or getting them working with us on a one-to-one basis really helped address some of those challenges everyone was facing, and also generated even more collaboration between the group and me and Sam. And we also were really fortunate to have two brilliant volunteers working with us. I don't know whether they're here today or not, but so a shout out to David and Elaine if you are here. They supported us, as it would have been absolutely impossible for me and Sam to inclusively deliver the sessions without them. So we had a team of volunteers helping us. Something that kept coming up in conversations was the independence that the residents wanted to get across. You know, they felt often that the Watch Factory was seen as a care home, and they wanted to talk about all the things they still do independently. So we decided to document what life was like in the Watch Factory, what it's really like. So we gave them cameras to use for a week, whether it was at the bingo or shopping or doing the washing, to document a week in the life of a Watch Factory. We also use digital cameras to capture the inside and outside of the Watch Factory as it is today, which came off the back of conversations about them being, I suppose, the new custodians of the Watch Factory, with all this heritage archive story sat behind them. And we'd bring the images together and talk about them and choose favourites, talking about why they were the favourites, what makes a good photo, what the difference was between the colour shots and black and white, how they felt when they looked at the images. And then we got them to annotate them using inspiration from some of the writing sessions that Sam had done with the group. With one resident who has no speech or ability to handwrite, Sam came up with the idea of emailing question prompts before each session, which meant they could prepare some answers in advance for conversational creative tasks, which we then read out. And we felt it was really important to honour the fact that because someone can't do something in the moment, it doesn't mean they have to be excluded. And the residents were also well into their gardening and the outdoor space of the Watch Factory, and quite a few of them chatted about being really active as young people. So we started looking at different ways in which they could bring in these interests whilst thinking about the heritage of the building. So we'd looked in sessions at how artists alter images and old found postcards, things like that. So we tried collage using pressed flowers. We found postcards of the Watch Factory combined with some of the original images they'd taken. We also took inspiration from the Watch Factory being a printers after the war, and started thinking about how we could make our own prints using the flora and fauna theme. So we tried cyanotypes and lumens and did a macro session with them in the garden. And like I said before, this cameraless photography was just such an accessible and engaging way to inspire conversation as well as create work. And you can see a couple of the finished pieces here, and that's Frida's on the left and Jane's on the right. So we carried on with lots of different creative photography sessions, but we didn't really focus on any technical skills because the camera was very much secondary to the conversation. We used it just as a device to encourage the residents to share stories. And we found that, I think, because of the different needs and the inclusive approach we had to take, things took longer in each session that we'd planned. But as ever with this kind of work, it's absolutely about quality of experience and not the quantity of output. And then once we got to the summer, we started pulling out their work as we had permission and budget to display it, which by this point they were really keen on. And we'd been clear that there was a possibility of doing that if they wanted to, but we'd kind of left the ball in their court with it. So we had Liz come in from Open Eye to talk to the group about the different ways you can curate and display work. We spent another 3 or so weeks theming and grouping the work based on some of the conversations we'd had, and the residents decided with me, Sam and our volunteers, where that work was going to be displayed at the Watch Factory. So we had sites indoors and outdoors. And then on install day, we all got involved. So you can see Jane and Mary deciding the height and order of the lumen prints there, and then Sam working with Jane to decide the ordering of these giant cyanotypes. We have printed up for the foyer, which just look brilliant in the space. They look quite small on there, but they are massive. And then in September we had an opening, which was a great, opportunity, I suppose, for everyone to come together and celebrate the project and the fact that the photography club had become established, and they were going to continue with a little more support from Sam into this year. And you can see on the slide there just some of the places the work was displayed all around the building, and it is open to the public, so if you are in Prescott, do pop in and have a look. What was great about that event was how the residents actually took some of the guests around to show them their work and chat about the project. And then we didn't stop there. We took them for a Christmas outing to Open Eye Gallery so they could see their work on display in the digital screens, and they were able to see the Sony photo awards, which were up at the time too. And we had conversations around that and how they wanted to see the club go forward into this year. This was Jane's speech that she wrote for the celebration event to share on behalf of the group. And I think this will probably stay on my wall for a long time, because it really captures what we were trying to do through the project. And I love Jane's line there of, I now look beyond the image to try and find the reason the image was taken. You know, I think we tried really hard to find ways to make this project inclusive so that everybody could take part in some way, no matter what their ability or need. And I think both Sam and I learned a lot through just giving things a go, but also because the members were just so up for trying new things. They were just a brilliant bunch, and they would tell us if something didn't or wouldn't work. They were very vocal about that. So there were some specific learning points that came out of that Watch Factory project, which I've written up on my blog in case you're going to be working in a similar setting. You might want to have a look at those. I've only done 3 of these socially engaged commissions now, and I've made a whole range of mistakes. So I thought I'd just quickly share some of those with you. So I've learned to allow longer than you think you need, or I think I need, to recruit participants. And the second point there is linked. So the term photography I found can put some people off. So I found in a couple of recent projects, I've struggled to recruit because there hasn't been a clarity around what photography actually means. And then I've had to kind of play down that word because they think it's going to be simply about me taking photos of them or something like that. So clarity around what you're expecting them to do and be part of is really key. People said it to me, but I didn't quite take it on board to start with. You need to spend lots of time building trust with people. It's possibly the most important part of the whole project, and it makes things so much easier later on in the process. So definitely invest time in doing it. Sam has taught me a lot through the Watch Factory process, but I think the main thing he taught me was not to be obsessed with planning. So I am a huge planner. I always have been and need to with my other freelance hat, but this work cannot be planned within an inch of its life. It is iterative, and you are going week to week, flying by the seat of your pants. So if you're like me, you just either need to get used to that or don't do this kind of work. And similarly, I come from a world where high quality outputs and funder requirements and what that high quality kind of looks like are really important, and that does not have a place here. It's about defining what success looks like with the people you're involved in. That's the most important thing. And what you don't show, like the conversations, is possibly more successful or more important than what you do show. Excuse me. So that's something I've learned. I also had one project which just didn't go well because my understanding of socially engaged practice was different to the commissioner. And despite various discussions, that was never reconciled and meant the project ultimately failed. So make sure you're really on the same page when it comes to the overarching aims and your definition of socially engaged work. There's also this, there's often this dilemma of the artist parachuting in and then doing a really lovely job and then going away again with these kinds of projects. And the Watch Factory Photography Club is designed to carry on and be equipped to do that when we're not there. But many projects don't have that legacy strategy. The one I mentioned before that failed was exactly like that. And it felt awful that people were essentially just dumped with no legacy in place. So that needs budgeting and a bit of budgeting for and considering. I think the other thing is it's really easy with this kind of work, and I talk about this a lot on my blog, to get imposter syndrome and worry about what other people are doing with socially engaged practice, rather than just getting on with what you want to do and what's relevant to your participants. So I've tried really hard to move away from that by remembering that you don't know their group, you don't know the conversations they're having or the artist's overall approach to socially engaged practice, which might be different to yours. And then I think it's really important to recognise that this work is about care, and that doesn't just involve the people and process, but it involves you too as a practitioner. So we sadly lost Jane, who I spoke about earlier. She died just before Christmas, and that came as quite a big shock to us. And I think it's very easy to get attached through the relationships you make through this kind of work, and there is an element of self-preservation, I think, here to consider. And then finally, there's also times when I've not felt sure about the line I'm treading when it comes to photo ethics. And I think that's mainly due to my lack of experience and knowledge in the field. So I've been worried that I'm doing something wrong or not in the right way. So I'm on very much a steep learning curve with it. And I've been trying to bring myself up to speed through listening and learning about photo ethics over the last 6 months. And as you can probably imagine there's lots of different ethical dilemmas and questions to think about when you're working in this socially engaged way. So these are just some of the questions of a whole range of them that have come up for me over the last couple of years trying this way of working. And if you're new to this, like I am, I'd really encourage you to check out the Photo Ethics podcast. I'm sure Rosie will share that in the chat in case you're not familiar with it. There's a particularly good episode by Anthony Rivera, who talks about his journey with photo ethics and the questions it's raised. And the centre are encouraging photographers to reflect on their own practice in a statement of ethics campaign at the moment. So I've been working on my own commitment, and you can have a look at that on my website. It's structured around what I've called the 5 C's, so care, clarity, communication, consent, and confidentiality. Bit of a mouthful, but it's a really good exercise to do. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that and make a pledge of your own. But if you are thinking about doing this type of work and don't know where to start, I've just put a few general tips together. So I think it's important to say that it's not for everyone. I'm still working out whether it's for me. I'd say find a training or CPD program or network to get involved in if you can. Work on a live project so you can test if it's actually something you want to do. If you're in a position where you can afford to take some time out in the day or evening to volunteer, you might be able to find a socially engaged photographer who's looking for support on socially engaged projects. So get to know who those photographers are and just ask. They might say no, but that's the worst thing that will happen. I'd say start following photographers that are doing this kind of work. I've just listed a few here that inspire me, and educate yourself. So start reading socially engaged publications like Social Works, which is an artist-led journal from the team at Axis that run the Social Art Library. So take notice of what's going on in this field. And then finally, think about whether Arts Council's developing your creative practice is something worth going for. It absolutely isn't for everyone, and it's not there to fund a project. It's to fund your personal development and R&D time. But for me, once I got mine after a second attempt, it really helped develop ideas and thinking around inclusive practice. And also, really, it gave me permission to ring fence that CPD time in the day, as well as introduce me to new contacts. And I'll talk more on Arts Council before we finish. I am conscious of time, Rosie. I'm on it. So I feel like I'm in a privileged position where I feel I can talk in an honest way about the realities of finding my way as an artist, because it hasn't all been plain sailing. So firstly, managing the realities of running 2 freelance businesses. So some of you might be in a similar position where you need to balance another freelance job or part-time job with building up a photography career. The main thing to say is I found it really hard to juggle, and I've not got the balance right yet. I can't afford to do an academic course, so I've had to spend time developing my learning and skills after hours, if you like. I've got caring commitments at home, so I've needed to build it around that too. So you've got to be willing to do that, I think. Secondly, you've got to come to terms with the fact that you can only do so much. So sometimes it's really hard to see other experienced photographers on social media doing all sorts of things. But if you're not doing this work full time, you will make slower progress. You will get fewer commissions, and you will have less time for creating work. So again, I found it really useful to come back to my own why and why I'm doing this, and to remember that everyone's on their own journey with photography. So try not to make those comparisons. Easier said than done. I think it's important to say that something has to give. So if you're running 2 freelance businesses like me, it is impossible to fit in 2 lots of marketing, 2 lots of client management, 2 lots of admin in the space of 1 working week, especially if that week is squeezed by things like the school run. So for me, the key to not losing my way has been in thinking like a business with both jobs. And what I mean by that is, make sure you have the right admin in place or finance processes, setting fees properly, learning how to say no. I track my time rigorously, so I use Toggle for that, which you can get on your PC or phone for free. I also use Trello to manage all my projects, and I subcontract where I feel I can afford to, and that gives me some time back. So I pay an accountant to look after the 2 businesses. And I've had some success this year experimenting with carving out specific days in the week and setting my out of office for the other business, so that time is made distinct between the 2 things. Practically, it doesn't always work, but it's really helped to focus on one thing at a time, as well as client management. The second thing is around managing in the artist world, as I call it, and the realities of this type of work compared with, say, shooting for corporate clients or family documentary work and that kind of thing. There's lots of brilliant things I love about being an artist, but there's also some major barriers and challenging things, which I do think we need to talk about. But again, I acknowledge my privilege and position in being able to do that. So with socially engaged practice, it's really easy to put in more hours than you're actually paid for. And there's a really interesting article by Eleonora Belfiore on this issue, which you can get online, and I'd encourage you to have a read of it. But from my experience so far, project or scope creep is pretty common because, of course, we care about the work and the people we're working with. Money isn't the main driver for me doing socially engaged practice, and it might not be for you, but you've got to have some discipline on where you draw the line, as you can end up doing a lot of work for free. Secondly, it is competitive. So personally, I've found it better to go for photography-based commissions for socially engaged work rather than ones that are open to all different types of art forms, because the pool is smaller with the photography ones. Thirdly, I would say, and I'm putting it mildly, there's some really frustrating procurement practices out there to be aware of, and I've been on the end of some of them, and I think there's a real need in the wider cultural sector, not just with artist commissions, to call out bad practice and start addressing it. As I'm sure some of you will have experienced, there can be impossibly short proposal deadlines, vague briefs, very limited or no feedback following applications, fees which sit well below AN's fair pay for artist guidelines, for example. So make sure you know your rights, make sure what you should be charging as an artist, make sure you're kind of aware of these kind of things. And I think I've had to discount a lot of professional development opportunities because, quite rightly, they're predominantly aimed at graduates or young people and helping them to get up a step up into the profession. But it would be great to have some schemes inclusive of working parents or those of us who are non-graduates or embarking on photography later in life. And finally on this, just to be completely honest, I couldn't work as an artist doing this kind of work without another income stream, certainly not at the level I'm working at. So I have to do corporate or private work like brand photography and events to make up for the shortfall in income. Now, the reality, certainly in my experience at my level, is that artist day rates are substantially lower than the corporate and private client rate. So, I get paid at least double a day with corporate clients than I do on artist projects. Now, I don't do artist projects for the income. That's not my why. But if it's yours, then you'll need to be aware of that. So to finish off then, what's next for me? Well, firstly, I'm going to keep up with my corporate and private client photography. I pitched my social documentary series about bell ringers to Bolton Museum and Art Gallery, who are going to show it later this year, which is great. You can see this on my website if it's of interest. I'm also in the process of working on Brewsters, which is a new social documentary series exploring the experiences of women working in the brewing and micropub industry. But my main artist project now is a new socially engaged project using photography to explore and document people's experiences of menopause. It's funded by an Arts Council project grant, and it's supported by a whole range of housing and health providers in Bolton. So along with cis women, I'm going to be working with the LGBTQI plus community to challenge the gendered and heteronormative narrative around menopause and open up conversations around different lived experiences with menopause. And as you can see on the right there, there's also an archival element. So it also includes drawing on archive collections around menopause to stimulate conversations with people I'm working with in those groups. So in case any of you are thinking of applying for a DYCP or project grant to run projects like the Menopause one, I thought it might be useful before we go into any questions, just to share some final tips that I think helped me to get to grips with it all, because I've got no fundraising experience. I will preface this by saying I'm no expert, but for what it's worth, I'd say, first of all, really make sure you're clear on the difference between a DYCP and a project grant. They are different, and to know the criteria and guidelines for applying inside out. So I had my first project grant application rejected because I'd put a budget line in for carbon offsetting, which isn't allowed. It is in black and white in the guidance, but I completely missed it. So be careful with that. And if you need any help, there's an access pathway, so make use of that. I'd say don't start an application until you're absolutely sure it's the right pot of money for you and your practice or your project, so you're not wasting your time. And similarly, make sure that you've got time not just to write it, but to research and develop it and develop relationships with partners. So my project grant took me most of last year to develop and write. There's lots of briefings given by Arts Council and other organisations to go to, so go to them, but quiz the person that's doing them to get the answers you need. That was really important and useful for me. And talk to other artists. So I spoke to various colleagues who've been successful and unsuccessful who are really generous with their time. And I'm happy to chat to anyone about my application, and I'm happy to share my application as well. I think one thing that got me through my DYCP second attempt, for those of you thinking about that, was I was much clearer the second time round on articulating the why now response. So I'd say really focus on what's special about you. Why is it important now? Why should you get the money now rather than any other time? And then a couple of resources that have helped me. So White Pube has a whole library of other applications to look at. That's really a great resource. And I used the brilliant tools from the Uncultured. So big thanks to them. They've got a range of templates for Arts Council applications. Just check they're using the latest ones. And that kind of means you can work offline from Grantium, which is Arts Council's application portal, and save yourself a whole heap of time and crying. So take a look at those. Right, Rosie, I'm going to finish up there. So I hope there's been something useful of interest to you in the stuff I've been saying this lunch time. Please get in touch if you're interested in collaborations or just finding out more about any aspects of my work. I'll happily chat to anyone, especially if it involves a cup of tea. And Rosie, yeah, I'll hand back to you for the questions, if there are any.
Brilliant.
So I'm a bit over on my time by 3 minutes, but
no, that was like spot on. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. What a brilliant talk. It was so lovely to hear about your whole journey and the really helpful pros and cons, tips, and what you've learned along the way. So thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed that. If there are any questions, do feel free to, you're welcome to unmute and ask, or pop them in the chat and I can read them out for you. There was a lot of information in that talk, so that was brilliant.
Sorry, I like completely packed it.
No, it's great. What a great use of time. At least everyone got, their money's worth. That, not that this was a paid talk, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Does anyone have a question?
Ginny.
Oh yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. It sounds like you've achieved so much in the time, especially with the pandemic thrown in there as well. I was just going to ask about sort of balancing. Have you got any tips on that balance between leading and that? Whether you can say any more about involving everybody's input into a project, I guess, and how much do you come with versus how much do you allow to develop?
Yeah, it's really hard, because the first thing I wanted to do when I started socially engaged practice, and I don't know whether Sam's here or be watching it, but we sat down at the start because it was the first big project I worked on, really, the Watch Factory one, and I was like desperate to plan 10 weeks straight off of like, well, we'll do lumens, we'll do sound attacks, we'll do this and this, and you just can't work like that. So that's what I'm talking about when now I've learned to you come with that creative framework. They don't know what kind of creative approaches you could use, but it's all about the conversations, then linking in with that. So for me, we'll use kind of starting points. So with the Menopause project, for example, I'm going in those first session, not the first sessions, those will be like the Watch Factory ones, but maybe like the third or fourth session, because they're 10 weeks worth of workshops, they're not as long. I'll be going in maybe with some stimulus material from the Wellcome Collection Library around how menopause visual imagery looks, lots of women in the 70s and 80s doing this with the heads and this, and pictures of pill boxes and the headline narratives that I used, and there's so much material to go on. So I will bring that to stimulate those conversations, but say like they will then, the conversation might lead into sleep deprivation, let's say. So then I'll start thinking in like after that session, okay, well, how can we use photography as a tool to document and explore that a little bit more? So whether it's through, so for example, it could be just doing flat lays of the medicines they use to go to sleep, or whether it's thinking about colours and what colours represent how they feel when they can't get to sleep, and doing something around that. Or I've been looking into the herbal remedies that were used in medieval times for menopause, for example, and taking those things and using them in the lumens. it depends where those conversations go, but I match the creative framework to those conversations. So the next week I might come with, okay, we talked about sleep deprivation, we're going to give this a go this week. And then they give you feedback to say, well, they kind of, they just start generating the ideas because you start them off, and then it just becomes collaborative through the discussion. So whilst you're doing the lumen prints, they might say, oh, it'd be great, like with the watch factory, it'd be great, we show them some documentary photography, why can't we document like what's going on in the watch factory? It just comes through the conversation. And that's why with this type of work, that time that you give those conversations is so important, because that's where the work is, that's where the ideas are. But it's really difficult to bottle that and present it. You know, most of the work for Watch Factory is not in the stuff that I've shown you today. So I don't know, there's a couple of practical examples there, but it is really difficult to do and difficult for me to define how it happens as well.
No, that's great thing. I'm like you, I'm a planner, so I have to have a bit of a mindset shift, I think.
Oh, completely, yeah.
No, thank you.
Cool. Are there any more questions that anyone wanted to ask? No. I had a little question, Marge, just because I know you've spoken a couple of times in your talk about feeling imposter syndrome, and I know you mentioned it to me as well. I was just wondering, how do you tackle that, especially when starting like a new project or a new commission?
Yeah, I think it's just something that I think a lot of us have, and I think it doesn't help when you're looking on Instagram, and I always have this thing of like, oh gosh, I'd thought of that, and then someone's already done it, or oh, I don't want to be the same as everyone else, and everyone's annotating photos, should I be doing something different? And actually it's about what's, like I said, what's right for your group, and not worrying about what everyone else is doing, because it might be something, their group might be different. But for me, and I kind of, it's what I said in the presentation, really, it's about pinning your why up. Like I'm looking over here because I've got like my why on the wall. So my why, for example, if you're looking through like the wonderful work of some of the photographers you see in the headlines or you see in exhibitions all the time, we all know who they are, we see them popping up and they do the most amazing work. When you're looking through that and feeling like, oh, I'll never be able to do that, or I've not got time, or how am I ever going to be like that? It's about like their why might be different to yours, or like I said, they're full time and you're working part time. For me, it's always back to that core, remembering why I'm doing something, and not always, but often that kind of snaps me out of it a little bit. And I think the other thing with imposter syndrome is just surrounding yourself with people who are your peers, who you have an open and honest discussion about those things. So Crossing Sectors was great for that. So I particularly talked to Kira Lehman, who some of you will know. Me and Kira will often message each other about, oh, I'm feeling a bit wobbly about this, or what do you think about that? So just having those people to go to who will just say to you, don't be daft, you've done it before, and just to reassure you, I think can help too. And then it's things like today, this is the first time I've talked really about my work. I think I did a really short session for OpenEye after I did the micro commission, but when you're preparing something like today, you kind of realize how much you've done. I mean, I've only started in 2019 so I think you kind of start, I say this with my other freelance world as well, there is no one there giving you a pat on the back, you are your own boss. And so I think it's important to put time in to regularly reflect and to put yourself up for things like this, to go through that reflection process, because it does give you a bit of a confidence boost to think, do you know what, I have actually done quite a few things. So I'd encourage people to kind of put those reflective practice, put time aside for reflective practice, and really look at what your wins are, I suppose, related back to your why. But yeah, I think it's something we all have it, I don't know, but yeah,
definitely. I think lots of artists struggle with imposter syndrome and a lack of confidence in their work, and just there's so much, the industry is so saturated, it's hard not to get caught up in comparing yourself to others, I think. So yeah, thank you for these tips, Marge, that's really helpful. And Will, your question in the chat, I will make sure that when we upload this to YouTube, we'll pop all the links in the description of the video on YouTube, so you should be able to find them there. It is just gone 2, so is there any final questions before we wrap up?
If anyone didn't feel comfortable asking a question in front of anyone else, please just email me, and you can follow me on wherever I am these days. And you know, and no question is a silly question, because I'm just learning this all myself too. So yeah, please do get in touch if you have anything else or anything springs to mind after today.
Absolutely, and we'll make sure to put all of Marge's links in the description of the YouTube video as well, so you'll be able to find that there if you haven't seen them already. But yeah, if there's no one else has a question to ask, we'll wrap up there very promptly, I think, actually. So yeah, thank you so much, Marge, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope everyone found that useful. And yeah, we'll see you all at another event soon, I'm sure. But yeah, thanks again, Marge, that was brilliant. Right.
Bye everyone.
Bye everyone.